The moment I opened that door and looked my mother dead in the eyes, I felt something I hadn't felt in 32 years of being her daughter. Absolute, bone-deep calm. Not rage, not tears, not that familiar knot in my stomach that used to form every single time her number showed up on my phone. Just calm. The kind of calm that comes when you finally run out of things to lose. She was standing there on my doorstep in her good coat, the beige one she only wore when she wanted to make an impression, with my father hovering 2 steps behind her like he always did, looking everywhere except at my face. She had that expression I'd seen 1,000 times, that particular arrangement of her features that said, "I am the wronged party here, and you will recognize that." She opened her mouth to start whatever speech she'd rehearsed in the car on the way over. I didn't let her get a word out. "If the apartment belongs to Ashley now," I said, and my voice was so steady it surprised even me, "then go live there. I have no room here. I have no money to give you, and I have no second chances left." And then I closed the door. Not slammed, closed. Quietly. The latch clicked into place like a period at the end of a very long sentence. I stood in my hallway for a full minute, listening to the silence on the other side. Then I heard my father's muffled voice say something, then footsteps retreating down the stairs, and then nothing. I slid down the wall until I was sitting on the floor with my back against the door, knees pulled up to my chest, and I thought, how did we get here? Because the answer to that question is not simple. It is not a single moment, or a single choice, or one bad day that went sideways. It is years. It is a whole architecture of small surrenders and quiet manipulations, and love that got weaponized so gradually that I didn't even notice until I was standing in the rubble of everything I'd built, trying to figure out whose hands had torn it down. Let me take you back. Back to when things were still good, or at least when I believed they were. My name is Megan. Megan Claire Hartwell, though I dropped the Hartwell when I got married and became Megan Calloway, which felt like stepping into a new version of myself that I actually liked. I grew up in Deerfield, Illinois, a suburb north of Chicago where the houses all have 2-car garages, and the HOA sends passive-aggressive letters about your lawn before the snow even fully melts. My parents, Linda and Robert Hartwell, lived in the same split level on Birchwood Drive for 34 years. Same cream-colored carpet in the living room. Same floral wallpaper in the downstairs bathroom that my mother chose in 1991 and refused to change because, as she said, "It still looks perfectly fine." Growing up, I was the responsible one. That was my assigned role in the Hartwell family drama, and I wore it the way you wear a backpack. So long and so constantly that you stop feeling the weight until you finally set it down. My sister Ashley, 3 years younger, was the one who cried until she got what she wanted, the one who could look at my mother with those big brown eyes and dissolve every boundary in a 10-mile radius. Ashley wasn't mean about it, not really. She just knew, from a very early age, exactly how the household worked. I did well in school. I got a partial scholarship to DePaul, worked part-time at a coffee shop on Fullerton to cover the rest, and graduated with a degree in accounting that felt very practical and very boring and was, in fact, both of those things. My first real job was at a mid-sized firm in the Loop. Nothing glamorous, a lot of spreadsheets, a lot of fluorescent lighting, but it paid $52,000 a year and had dental, and after 4 years of ramen noodles and shared apartments with 3 roommates, that felt like absolute wealth. I met Daniel Calloway at a work happy hour when I was 26. He was a project manager at a construction company, tall, quiet in a way that read as confident rather than shy, with this habit of actually listening when you talk to him, like really listening, not just waiting for his turn to speak, that I found completely disarming. We dated for 2 years, got engaged at Millennium Park on a November evening when it was so cold my fingers went numb, and got married in June at a small venue in Evanston with 72 people and a DJ who played too much early 2000s hip-hop, but nobody really minded. Our apartment was in Rogers Park, on the north side of Chicago. Second floor of a 3-flat, hardwood floors, a kitchen that was smaller than some closets I've seen, but had a window over the sink that looked out onto a maple tree, and I loved that window more than almost anything in that apartment. We paid $1,450 a month, which even 5 years ago was a deal, and we were careful with money. Both of us, almost compulsively so. We had a joint savings account, a Roth IRA each. Daniel had a 401k through his company, and we were about 14 months away from having a real down payment saved for an actual house. I had a spreadsheet. Of course I had a spreadsheet. Daniel's family was from Indiana. Warm, loud, the kind of family that showed up to things with too much food and stayed 3 hours longer than planned, and somehow you were always glad they had. Thanksgiving at his parents' house in Muncie was loud and chaotic and wonderful. His mother Carol made a green bean casserole from scratch, and his father Jim fell asleep in the recliner before 9 o'clock every single year without fail. My family was different. My family was quieter, tighter, and the tension in that quiet was something you learned to read early, the way you learn to read weather. The specific quality of my mother's silence that meant she was keeping score, the way my father went very still when she was unhappy, as if stillness could make him invisible. Linda Hartwell was not a bad person. I want to be clear about that because it matters. She was not cruel in the obvious ways. She didn't yell, didn't throw things, wasn't the kind of mother who said openly terrible things that you could point to later and say, "There, that's the wound, that's where it started." She was subtler than that. She had this gift for making you feel, without a single explicit word, that you had fallen short of something, that whatever you had done, it wasn't quite enough, that the love she had for you was real but conditional, and the conditions were always shifting just slightly out of reach. She loved Ashley more openly. I don't say that with bitterness, not anymore. I say it because it was simply, observably true, the way the sky is blue and the rent is too damn high. Ashley was softer, more demonstrative, more willing to perform the kind of closeness my mother wanted. I was the one who asked questions, who pushed back gently on things, who at 17 told my mother that I thought she was being unfair and watched her face close like a door. We never talked about it again. But she didn't forget, and I didn't forget that she didn't forget, and that knowledge lived in the space between us for 15 years. My father, Robert, was a good man trapped in the amber of a marriage he'd stopped fighting for somewhere around 1998. He was gentle, quietly funny, loved baseball and woodworking and bad action movies, and had somewhere along the way decided that peace, the absence of conflict, was the most valuable thing in his household. So he kept his head down. He went along. When my mother made decisions, he nodded. When she expressed opinions, he agreed. It was not cowardice exactly. It was survival. I understood it. I just sometimes wished, quietly and without saying so, that he would choose differently. Through all of this, Daniel was my anchor. Our apartment was mine in a way that my childhood home had never felt. We cooked dinner together on Sunday evenings. Daniel did pasta, I did everything with chicken, and watched too much television and argued about whether the thermostat should be at 68 or 70, and it was ordinary and small and exactly what I had wanted my whole life without knowing I was allowed to want it. My mother called every Sunday morning at 9 o'clock. That was the ritual. I answered because not answering felt worse than answering, and we would talk for 20 minutes about things that never quite added up to anything. Her neighbor's new car, a sale at Macy's, something Ashley had said or done that was presented as neutral but never was. I always got off the phone feeling vaguely like I owed her something I couldn't identify. One Sunday in October, I remember the light was doing that particular fall thing where it comes in low and golden through the maple tree outside the kitchen window. She called at her usual 9 o'clock, and we did the usual 20 minutes, and right at the end, just as I was starting to wrap up the way I always did, she said something that I didn't think much about at the time. "Your father and I have been talking," she said, in the careful tone she used when she'd already made a decision and was presenting it as a discussion. "About the future. About what makes sense for the family." "Okay," I said, watching the maple tree drop one slow yellow leaf. "We'll talk more soon," she said. "There are some things we want to get settled." And then she said goodbye and hung up, and I set my phone down on the kitchen counter and Daniel looked up from his coffee and said, "Everything okay?" "Yeah," I said. "I think so." I believed that. I genuinely believed that. Standing in my kitchen with the fall light coming through the window and my husband's coffee going warm on the table and our savings account sitting at $47,300 and our whole, careful, built-from-scratch life humming along exactly as planned, I believed that everything was okay. I had no idea what was already in motion. The call I'd been half expecting came on a Thursday in November, 3 weeks after that cryptic Sunday conversation. I was at my desk at work, staring at a quarterly reconciliation that wasn't reconciling, when my phone buzzed with my mother's name. It was 2:17 in the afternoon. Not her usual time, not her usual day, and that alone made my stomach do a small, practiced clench. "Megan," she said, and her voice had that particular texture, warm on the surface, with something harder underneath, like a frozen lake with thin ice. "Your father and I would like to have you and Daniel over for dinner. Saturday, if you can manage it. There's something we want to discuss as a family." "Is everything okay?" I asked, because the words "as a family" from my mother's mouth had never once in my life meant something casual. "Everything is fine," she said, in the tone that meant, "Stop asking questions." 6 o'clock. I'm making the pot roast." The pot roast. Of course. She made pot roast for important occasions. Christmas Eve. The dinner when she told us she'd had a health scare that turned out to be nothing. The dinner when Ashley announced she was dropping out of community college. The pot roast was my mother's way of softening the room, of filling the house with something warm and familiar before she said whatever she'd already decided to say. I told her we'd be there and set my phone face down on my desk and sat very still for a moment, looking at the spreadsheet without seeing it. That evening, I told Daniel about the call while we were making dinner. He was doing pasta, I was doing the salad, our usual Thursday rhythm, and he looked over at me with that quiet, listening expression of his and said, "Did she give you any hint what it's about?" "No," I said, tearing romaine. "She said as a family, she's making pot roast." He was quiet for a second, stirring the sauce. "Could be anything." "Could be," I said, "but it's not nothing." He nodded slowly. He'd been around my family long enough to understand the difference between the things my mother said and the things she meant, and to know that the gap between those two things was where most of the damage happened. He reached over and squeezed my hand once, briefly, warmly, and then went back to stirring. That was Daniel. He didn't over-reassure. He didn't tell me I was being paranoid. He just acknowledged the thing and stayed close. God, I loved that about him. Saturday came cold and gray, the kind of Chicago November that feels personal. We drove up to Deerfield in Daniel's truck, and I watched the suburbs unspool past the window. The strip malls, and the gas stations, and the big box stores giving way to the quieter, tree-lined streets of the neighborhood I grew up in. And I felt that old, familiar compression in my chest that I always felt when I was heading back to Birchwood Drive. Not dread exactly, just a particular kind of readiness. The way you brace before something hits. Ashley's car was already in the driveway when we pulled up. A detail I noted and filed away, because Ashley lived 40 minutes away in Naperville and didn't come to family dinners unless my mother specifically asked her to. So, whatever this was, Ashley already knew about it. That told me something. My mother opened the door before we knocked. She'd been watching for us, which she always did and always denied doing, in a blouse I recognized as one she saved for company, and she smiled at Daniel and hugged him with genuine warmth, the way she always did, because Daniel was the kind of son-in-law who made it easy to love him. Then she hugged me, briefly, the kind of hug that is technically a hug, and said, "Come in, it's cold." The house smelled like pot roast and something else underneath it, not quite anxiety, but the human equivalent of before a storm. Ashley was in the living room, sitting on the couch with her feet tucked under her, holding a glass of wine, and she looked up when we came in and gave me a smile that I can only describe as careful. Ashley's smiles were usually wide and easy. This one was measured. "Hey, Meg," she said. "Hey," I said, and sat down in the armchair across from her while Daniel went with my father into the kitchen, because my father had the excellent instinct to always put Daniel to work on something the minute we arrived, which I think was his way of giving me a few minutes with my mother and sister before the main event. My mother settled into her usual chair, the wingback near the window that was undisputedly hers, in the way that certain chairs in certain houses belong to certain people, and folded her hands in her lap and looked at me with an expression that I recognized as composed. "We'll talk over dinner," she said. "But I wanted you to know, before we sit down, that what we're going to discuss comes from a place of love and practicality." "Okay," I said. "Your father and I have been doing some estate planning," she said. "Working with an attorney. It's just responsible at our age to have things in order." "That's a good idea," I said carefully. Ashley was looking at her wineglass. "We'll talk at the table," my mother said again, and stood up and went to check on the pot roast, and I looked at Ashley and said, very quietly, "What's going on?" Ashley met my eyes for exactly 1 second and then looked away. "Mom wants to explain it," she said. "Just keep an open mind, okay?" Keep an open mind. Those 3 words landed in my stomach like a stone dropping into water. Dinner was the specific kind of painful that only family dinners can be. The food was genuinely good, the conversation was relentlessly surface level, and everyone at the table knew that we were all just getting through the pot roast before the real thing started. My father talked about the Cubs, which he did when he was nervous. Daniel talked to him about the Cubs, which he did because he was kind. Ashley refilled her wineglass twice. I ate and waited. My mother cleared the plates with the precise efficiency of a woman executing a plan, declined my offer to help, and came back to the table with coffee and a folder. An actual manila folder, the kind with a metal clasp at the top. She set it in the center of the table like she was presenting evidence. "Your father and I," she began, in the careful, rehearsed tone she'd clearly been practicing, "have made a decision about the apartment." I blinked. "Which apartment?" "The one on Maple Street," my father said quietly, not quite looking at me. "The rental unit." I knew the apartment. My parents had owned a small, 2-bedroom rental unit in a neighboring town since before I was born, bought it in the early 90s, always had a tenant, never a huge income, but steady, reliable. I had always assumed, vaguely, in the way you assume things about your parents' assets when you're young and don't think about mortality, that it would eventually be divided equally between Ashley and me. "We've decided," my mother said, opening the folder, "to sign it over to Ashley." The table was very quiet. "Not to sell it," she continued, "not to divide it. We feel that Ashley's situation, her being single, not having Daniel's income to rely on, the instability of her work, makes her the more appropriate recipient. It's already been seen by a notary. The paperwork is essentially complete." I looked at the folder. I looked at Ashley. Ashley was looking at the table. "When did you decide this?" I asked. "We've been discussing it for some time," my mother said. "And when were you planning to tell me?" "We're telling you now," she said, with a slight lift of her chin that meant, "This is not a conversation, it's a notification." I felt Daniel's hand find mine under the table. I held it and breathed, and said, very evenly, "I see, and you've already signed the paperwork." As I said, essentially complete. "So, this is—" I stopped. Started again. "You're not asking for my input. You're informing me." "Megan," my father said, and his voice was tired, the voice of a man who has watched something coming for a long time and couldn't stop it. "We thought about this carefully." "I'm sure you did," I said, and I meant it, but not the way it sounded. I didn't make a scene. I want to be honest about that. I did not flip the table or raise my voice or say any of the things that were forming in the back of my mind like storm clouds. I sat there, and I held Daniel's hand, and I listened to my mother explain, in her measured, practical way, all the reasons this was the logical and loving choice. Ashley's recent job instability, Ashley's breakup with her long-term boyfriend the previous year, Ashley's need for a safety net that I, with my accounting job and my responsible husband, and my Roth IRA and my savings spreadsheet did not require. What I was, apparently, was stable enough to not need anything at all. We drove home mostly in silence. Daniel didn't push. He knew me well enough to let me get there on my own. It was somewhere around Evanston, the city lights starting to blur past the windows, when I finally said it out loud. "They already signed it," I said. "Before they told me. They made the decision, went to a notary, got it done, and then invited me to dinner to inform me over pot roast." "Yeah," Daniel said, quiet, careful. "They didn't ask, didn't consider, didn't—" I stopped. Ashley knew. She knew when we walked in. "I noticed," he said. I pressed my fingers against the cold window glass and watched the highway lights stream past. "The thing that I keep thinking," I said slowly, "is that they weren't wrong about the logic. On paper, we're more stable. On paper, Ashley needs it more. I can follow the reasoning." "But," Daniel said. "But nobody asked me," I said. "Nobody looked me in the face and said, 'Megan, how do you feel about this?' Nobody thought about what it means to have your parents decide, without a word to you, that your sister gets the inheritance and you get to be fine because you're the responsible one." I heard my voice go rough at the edges and cleared my throat. "I'm always fine. I've always been fine. That's the whole problem." Daniel was quiet for a long moment, and then he said, "What do you want to do?" "Nothing," I said. "What is there to do? It's done." I looked at the highway. "I just want to go home." So, that was October. And November. And December, which we spent with Daniel's family in Muncie, where Carol made her green bean casserole from scratch, and Jim fell asleep in the recliner before 9, and I was grateful, so genuinely grateful, for the warmth and the noise and the feeling of being somewhere I didn't have to brace myself. I told myself I had processed it. I told myself it was fine. I told myself the thing I always told myself. You don't need anything from them. You built your own life. You are fine. I was so good at telling myself that. I had years of practice. And then in January, my mother called on a Sunday morning at 9 o'clock, exactly as always, and we did the usual 20 minutes. And right at the end, in that same careful voice, she said, "Your father and I have been thinking about the future. We may need to make some changes." And this time, the knot in my stomach didn't form slowly. It snapped into place like a seatbelt. "What kind of changes?" I asked. "We'll talk soon," she said. "There are some things we need to settle." Word for word. The exact same thing she'd said in October. The same tone, the same careful nothing phrasing that meant everything was already decided, and the dinner invitation was already in motion, and the only question was what was going to be on the table this time. I set my phone down. Outside the kitchen window, the maple tree was bare, all its branches showing against a white January sky. Daniel was still asleep. The apartment was quiet. I stood there for a long moment, and I thought about the folder on the dinner table. The notary, essentially complete. And I thought, what else have they already decided? What else is essentially complete that I don't know about yet? I didn't have the answer, but I had, for the first time, the absolute certainty that I needed to find it before they called me to another dinner to explain it to me over something warm. I didn't call Ashley. I want to be honest about that. My first instinct after that January Sunday call wasn't to pick up the phone and demand answers from my sister, who had clearly known something back in November when she sat there looking at her wineglass and told me to keep an open mind. My first instinct was to be still, to wait, to gather information before I opened my mouth, because I had learned a long time ago that in my family, the person who speaks first is the person who loses. So I waited. I went to work on Monday. I reconciled my quarterly reports. I ate lunch at my desk, and I thought about the word essentially. Essentially complete, my mother had said about the apartment paperwork, as if that one word had been a door she left slightly ajar, a small and probably unintentional crack of light. I thought about what else might already be essentially complete that I didn't know about yet. I started paying attention in a different way. That's the only way I know how to describe it. I started listening to what my mother didn't say. I started tracking the small inconsistencies. The way Ashley had seemed nervous rather than guilty at that November dinner. The way my father had said, "We thought about this carefully," in the voice of a man defending a verdict that had already been handed down, not a man who had participated in deliberation. 3 weeks passed. My mother called every Sunday at 9. We did the usual 20 minutes. She didn't mention the changes she'd referenced. She didn't bring up the future or what needed to be settled. She talked about her neighbor's car and a sale at Macy's and something Ashley had done that was presented as neutral. I listened and responded and got off the phone and stood at my kitchen window and looked at the bare maple tree and thought, she's waiting for something, or she's already done it. It was Daniel who finally said what I'd been circling. We were doing dishes on a Wednesday night. I washed, he dried, our usual rhythm, and he said, without preamble, the way he sometimes did when he'd been sitting with something for a while, "Have you thought about talking to someone? Like a professional? About the apartment situation?" I looked at him. "You mean a therapist?" "Or a financial advisor," he said. "Both, maybe. I've been thinking, your parents have assets. The apartment was one, but it probably wasn't the only one. If they're doing estate planning, there's a document that lays out all of it. A will, or a trust, or both. And you have no idea what's in it." I set the plate I was holding very carefully in the drying rack. "I know," I said. "And you can't ask them," he said, "because asking would be—" He paused, choosing his words. "A declaration of war," I said. "Yeah." He set down the dish towel. "But not knowing is also a choice. And I think not knowing is what they're counting on." I looked at my husband and felt something shift. Not dramatically, not a lightning bolt or a sudden clarity, but the slow, grinding movement of something that had been stuck beginning to come loose. He was right. The silence I'd been keeping, the patience I'd been practicing, the careful management of not rocking the boat, that wasn't me being mature. That was me doing exactly what I'd always done. Being the responsible one, the stable one, the one who didn't need anything and therefore didn't ask for anything and therefore got nothing and was expected to be fine. "I have a friend," Daniel said, "from the construction company. His wife is an estate attorney. Her name is Jennifer Marsh. She does consultations." I dried my hands on a dish towel and looked out the window at the dark street below. "You already looked into this," I said. "I looked up her office," he said. "That's all. I didn't call. I wanted to talk to you first." This is what I mean when I say I loved that about Daniel. He didn't act for me. He didn't take over and start making calls and present me with a plan. He brought me the information and waited. He understood, somehow, deeply, without my ever having to spell it out, that the most damaging thing about growing up in my family was that decisions had always been made for me, around me, about me, without my input. That what I needed more than help was agency. "Okay," I said. "Make the call." Jennifer Marsh's office was in Evanston, on the second floor of a building that also housed a dentist and a small insurance agency. She was maybe 50, sharp-eyed, with the particular manner of someone who had heard a lot of family financial disasters and had stopped being surprised by any of them, but had not stopped caring. She had a box of tissues on the corner of her desk, which I noticed immediately and hoped I wouldn't need. I told her the situation. The apartment on Maple Street, signed over to Ashley, essentially complete before I was informed. The Sunday calls, the phrase, "We're making some changes," the sense that something was already in motion. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she asked 3 questions. Did I know the name of the attorney my parents had used for the estate planning? Did I know whether they owned any other real property beyond the house on Birchwood Drive and the rental apartment? And did I have any reason to believe that either of my parents had cognitive decline or was being pressured by a third party? I said I didn't know the attorney's name. I said I wasn't sure about other property. And then I stopped at the 3rd question. "My mother is—" I started. "She's sharp. She's always been sharp. She makes decisions, and she believes they're the right ones, and she doesn't revisit them. There's no pressure from a third party. She is the third party. Jennifer Marsh wrote something down. "Here's what I want you to understand," she said. "Your parents have the legal right to distribute their assets however they choose. Ashley getting the apartment, as long as they were competent adults acting voluntarily, is entirely within their rights. You don't have legal grounds to contest it." "I know," I said. "But," she continued, "what you do have is information rights about your own financial future. If they have a will or a trust, you are not legally entitled to see it until they pass. However," she paused, "you are entitled to protect yourself. If there are transfers of assets happening that might affect their financial stability, and if at any point in the future they come to you with financial needs, you need to know where you stand." I looked at the tissues on the corner of her desk and felt my throat tighten. Not because of the legal information, because of the way she'd phrased that last part. If at any point in the future they come to you with financial needs. "Do you think they will?" I asked. She looked at me steadily. "You already think they will," she said, "or you wouldn't be here." And that was the thing I hadn't let myself say out loud. Not to Daniel, not to myself, not in all the weeks of careful silence and watchful waiting. The apartment wasn't just a hurt. It wasn't just a decision that stung because I'd been excluded. The apartment was a signal. My parents had given their one liquid asset outside of their house to Ashley, had secured her, had made her comfortable, and they had done it quietly, without discussion, while talking to me about the future and changes and things that needed to be settled. Why would you secure your one child and not the other, unless you already knew that the other one was going to be needed for something else? I drove home from Jennifer Marsh's office in the flat gray February light, and I sat in the parking garage under our building for 7 minutes before I went upstairs. Not crying, just sitting, just letting it land. Daniel was on the couch when I came in, laptop open, some work thing, and he looked up and read my face the way he always could, and closed the laptop without a word. "Tell me," he said. I told him. I told him all of it, what Jennifer had said, what I'd understood, the part about financial needs, the logic I'd been refusing to follow to its conclusion. I said it flat and even, and without the roughness in my voice that usually came when I talked about my family, because I had moved past the feeling and into something colder and more useful. "They gave Ashley the apartment," I said, "because they're planning to ask us for something. I don't know what. I don't know when. But the pot roast dinner, the estate planning, the changes, they were never about Ashley's stability. They were about clearing the board, making sure there was no asset to point to when they turned around and said they needed help." Daniel was very still. "Help meaning money." "Or more," I said. "Help meaning, I don't know, moving in, taking over something, some arrangement where I become the responsible one in a new and more expensive way." "Megan," he said, and his voice was careful, we don't know that for certain." "No," I said, "we don't." I looked at him. "But I'm not waiting to find out after it's already done. Not again." He nodded slowly. Once. The kind of nod that means, "I'm with you." "Jennifer said to document everything going forward," I said. "Every conversation, every request. She said to keep a record, in writing, of anything they ask for, and to get anything important in writing from them. She said that if the situation develops the way I'm describing, documentation is the only protection I have." "Okay," Daniel said. "She also said," I continued, "that if they do come to us with a financial request, specifically if they ever ask to move in, or ask for a loan, or ask for any kind of ongoing support, I should not agree to anything verbally, ever, under any circumstances." Daniel looked at me for a long moment. "You've already decided something," he said, not accusatory, just observant. "I've decided I'm not going to be fine about this anymore," I said. "That's all. I've decided that fine is not a plan." I called Ashley 2 days later, not to confront her, not yet, but because I needed to take the temperature of what she knew, and because there was a part of me, a stubborn and persistent part, that still believed my sister was not my enemy. That she had been a participant in my parents' plan, but not the architect of it. That she had sat at that dinner table, looking at her wine glass because she was uncomfortable, not because she was triumphant. She answered on the second ring, which was unusual. Ashley was a let-it-go-to-voicemail person. "Hey," she said. Careful. The same careful as the dinner. "I need to ask you something," I said, "and I need you to be honest with me." Silence. Then, "Okay. When Mom and Dad decided to sign the apartment over to you, was that the only thing they were planning? Or is there more?" The silence this time was longer, long enough that I counted 4 seconds in my head. "Megan," she said finally, and her voice had changed. The careful was gone, and something else was there, something that sounded almost like guilt, and underneath the guilt, something that sounded like fear. I think you should talk to Mom." "I'm talking to you," I said. "Right now." Another pause, and then, quietly, so quietly I almost didn't catch it, she said, "They've been talking about the house." The house. Birchwood Drive. The split level with the cream-colored carpet and the floral wallpaper. The house my parents had lived in for 34 years. My hands went very still on the phone. "What about the house?" I said. But Ashley had already pulled back. I could feel it, the door she'd cracked open swinging shut. "Talk to Mom," she said again. "Please, Meg, just talk to her." She hung up, and I stood in my kitchen with the phone in my hand and the maple tree bare and black against the February sky outside the window, and I understood, with a certainty that settled in my chest like cold water, that whatever was coming had been in motion for a very long time, and that I was already behind. I called my mother back that same afternoon. Not because I was ready, not because I had a plan fully formed and loaded and aimed, but because Ashley's voice, that quiet guilty they've been talking about the house, had cracked something open in me that I couldn't close back up, and sitting with it for another Sunday, another 20 minutes about Macy's and the neighbor's car, felt like a thing I was no longer capable of doing. She answered on the first ring. "Megan," she said warmly, the way she always said my name when she expected the call to go her way. "Tell me about the house," I said. A pause, brief but real. "I don't know what Ashley told you." "She told me enough," I said. "I want to hear the rest from you." Another pause, and then my mother did something I had not anticipated. She sighed, not the sharp defensive sigh she used when she felt cornered, but a longer, almost tired sound, and she said, "Your father and I have been thinking about downsizing. The house is too much for us. The maintenance, the taxes, the stairs. We're not getting younger." "Okay," I said, keeping my voice level. "And?" "We thought," she said, and here was the careful tone again, the rehearsed one, "that it might make more sense, financially, practically, to sell the house and for your father and me to move in with you and Daniel, just temporarily, while we figure out the next step." There it was. I had known it was coming. I had traced the logic of it from the apartment on Maple Street all the way to this moment, step by careful step, like following a trail of breadcrumbs through a forest I'd been walking my whole life. And yet, hearing it out loud, in my mother's voice, in that measured and eminently reasonable tone, it still landed like a fist in the sternum. "Temporarily," I said. "Of course," she said. "A few months, maybe 6, just until we find something suitable." "And the money from selling the house," I said. "What happens to that?" A beat. "That would be for our retirement, our living expenses going forward." "Right," I said. "So Ashley has the apartment on Maple Street. You sell the Birchwood Drive house and keep the proceeds. And Daniel and I absorb you both into our 2-bedroom apartment in Rogers Park for 6 months, or more, with no financial contribution from you." "Megan." Her voice had shifted. The warmth was still there, but the patience was thinning, the way ice thins at the edges in March. "We're your parents. This is what families do." "Families," I said, "talk to each other before they make decisions. Families ask. Families don't sign paperwork and then invite people to dinner to inform them. Silence. I'll need to talk to Daniel, I said. Don't do anything with the house until we've had a real conversation. All four of us. In person. Of course, she said, and the warmth was back because she had heard, I'll need to talk to Daniel as yes, and in person as a scheduling question, and she had entirely missed the temperature of my voice. Or she had heard it and decided to hear something else. With my mother, I was never entirely certain which. I hung up and sat at the kitchen table for a long time. When Daniel came home that evening, I was still at the table, in the dark, and he turned on the kitchen light and looked at me and said, "What happened?" I told him. He sat down across from me. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "What do you want to do?" "I want to call Jennifer Marsh," I said. "Tonight." I left a message. She called back the next morning. I laid it all out. The apartment, the house, the plan, the timeline my mother had presented as temporary and eminently reasonable. Jennifer listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she said, "Has she made any moves on the house yet? Listed it? Contacted a realtor?" "I don't know," I said. "She said don't do anything until we talk, but—" "But you don't trust that," Jennifer said. "I trust that she has already talked to someone," I said. The same way the apartment was essentially complete before I heard about it. "Then you need to move quickly," Jennifer said. "Not aggressively, but you need to have a documented conversation with both of your parents, in the presence of a witness if possible, where you state clearly and explicitly that you are not able to accommodate them in your apartment, that you are not in a position to provide financial support, and that any decisions they make about the Birchwood Drive property are theirs alone. You do not want to be in a position 6 months from now where they claim you agreed to something you didn't agree to." "I understand," I said. "Bring Daniel," she said, "and I'd suggest you also consider whether you want to bring Ashley." I thought about that for a long time. Here's the thing about Ashley. I had spent weeks being careful about her, careful not to make her the villain of a story that wasn't really about her, careful to remember that she had sat at that November dinner looking guilty rather than triumphant, careful to believe that she was more passenger than driver in all of this. And I still believed that. I believed it right up until the moment I called her back, 2 days before the dinner, and said, "I need you there. When we talk to Mom and Dad, I need you in the room." She was quiet for so long I thought the call had dropped. "Ashley," I said. "I can't," she said. "Megan, I can't be in the middle of this." "You're already in the middle of it," I said. "You have been since November. The apartment is in your name. You knew about the house before I did. You're in the middle whether you're in the room or not. The only question is whether you're there by choice." Another long silence, and then, very quietly, "What do you want from me?" "I want you to be honest," I said. "In front of all of us. About what you knew and when. That's all." She came. We met at Birchwood Drive on a Saturday in late February, gray and cold, the kind of day that makes Chicago feel like a permanent condition. Daniel drove. Ashley's car was already in the driveway. She'd beaten us there, which told me she'd needed the extra time to prepare herself or to talk to my mother before we arrived, or both. I noted it and let it go. My mother had not made pot roast. That told me she knew this was different. She'd made coffee. There was a plate of cookies from the grocery store bakery on the coffee table, the kind in the plastic clamshell container, which meant she hadn't planned this as a performance. Or she had, and the performance was, "We're just talking, this is casual, there's nothing here to brace for." I couldn't tell anymore. After 32 years, I sometimes couldn't tell. My father sat in his usual chair. Ashley was on the couch, hands folded, not looking at anyone. Daniel sat beside me on the love seat, and his hand found mine, and I held it. My mother opened. She did what she always did, led with warmth, led with practicality, made the request sound like a gift she was offering rather than a burden she was placing. The house was too much. They weren't getting younger. 6 months, maybe less, just until they found something suitable. They had savings, she said, not specifying how much, And they would, of course, contribute to groceries. Groceries. Daniel's hand tightened slightly around mine. I let her finish. I had learned, finally and completely, not to interrupt my mother mid-performance, because interrupting her mid-performance meant she could redirect the conversation to the interruption rather than the substance. I let her finish, and then I said, I want to make sure we're all on the same page about what you're asking. I kept my voice even. No roughness, no anger. Just the flat, clear voice I used at work when I was presenting a finding nobody wanted to hear. You want to sell the Birchwood Drive house, keeping the proceeds for your retirement, and move into our 2-bedroom apartment in Rogers Park for an undetermined length of time, contributing to groceries. It wouldn't be undetermined, my mother said, and I heard the slight defensive shift. 6 months. The apartment on Maple Street, I said, is now Ashley's property, correct? A small silence. Yes, my mother said. So Ashley has a 2-bedroom property in Naperville, I said, and you're asking to move into our 2-bedroom apartment in Rogers Park. My mother's expression flickered, just slightly. Ashley's situation is different. How? I said. She's single. She has a 2-bedroom apartment, I said, that you gave her, that has no mortgage on it because you signed it over free and clear. Daniel and I pay $1,450 a month in rent for ours. I paused. I'm not asking you to explain the logic of giving Ashley the apartment. That decision is made. What I'm asking is why the answer to your housing situation is to move into our space rather than hers. The room was very quiet. My father was looking at his hands. Ashley was looking at the window. My mother drew herself up, the particular posture she used when she was about to reframe. This family. Mom. Ashley's voice. Quiet, but there. Everyone looked at her. She was still looking at the window. Her hands were no longer folded. They were pressed flat against her thighs, the way they got when she was holding something still. She took a breath. I knew, she said, in November, about the house plan. Mom told me before the dinner. She looked up and met my eyes, and hers were bright and unhappy. She said you and Daniel were stable, that you could handle it, that I needed the apartment because I was on my own, and you had Daniel and your savings and your... She stopped, started again. She said you would understand. Did you think I would? I asked. Ashley looked at me for a long moment. No, she said. I didn't. Her voice broke slightly on the last word, and she pressed her lips together and looked back at the window. My mother started to speak. I held up one hand. I'm going to say something, I said, and I need you to hear all of it before you respond. She closed her mouth. That alone, the fact that she actually closed her mouth, told me something about how my voice sounded in that moment. I love you, I said. Both of you. I'm not here to punish you or to relitigate the apartment or to tell you that what you did was wrong according to some law I can cite. You had the right to give Ashley the apartment. It was yours to give. What I'm telling you is what I can and cannot do, as a fact, not as a negotiation. I felt Daniel beside me, steady and still. Daniel and I have a 2-bedroom apartment, I said. We are 14 months from a down payment on a house, a down payment we have been building, carefully, for 3 years. We cannot absorb 2 additional people into our space without derailing that plan entirely. We cannot do it financially, we cannot do it logistically, and I am telling you directly and clearly, we will not do it. Megan, my mother started, and her voice had that particular quality, the wronged party quality, the I am the wounded one here arrangement of syllables that I had been responding to and shrinking from and managing around for 32 years. I felt it. I felt the old pull, the old reflex to soften, to qualify, to find some way to give her something so that her expression would change. I felt it, and I let it pass through me like a wave that breaks and recedes. If the apartment belongs to Ashley now, I said, and my voice was so steady it surprised even me, then that is where your housing solution lives. I have no room here. I have no money to give you, and I have no second chances left to be the responsible one who absorbs the consequences of decisions that were made without asking me. The room was completely silent. My father looked up from his hands. His eyes were wet. He didn't speak. He looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen on his face before, something that might have been relief, or recognition, or the look of a man who had watched something coming for a very long time and had finally seen someone step out of its path. My mother's face did something complicated. The wronged party expression dissolved, and underneath it was something older and less composed, something that looked, for just a moment, like the face of a woman who had expected a door to open and had instead heard a latch click into place. She didn't speak. For the first time in my memory, my mother had nothing to say. We left 20 minutes later. There was nothing left to sit through. Daniel shook my father's hand, and my father held it for an extra second and said, very quietly, "Take care of her." Daniel said he would. I hugged Ashley at the door, a real hug, not a technical one, and she held on for a moment longer than usual and said, against my shoulder, "I'm sorry, Meg." I said, "I know," and I meant it. In the truck, heading south on I-94, the city rising ahead of us against the late February sky, Daniel reached over and put his hand on mine where it rested on my knee. He didn't say anything. Neither did I. There was nothing left to say that the afternoon hadn't already said. We closed on our house 11 months later. 3-bedroom colonial in Evanston, hardwood floors, a kitchen with a window over the sink that looked out onto a yard with 2 oak trees. 14 months of savings, untouched, exactly as planned. My parents sold Birchwood Drive and moved into a 2-bedroom condo in Naperville, 4 miles from Ashley, close enough for Sunday dinners, far enough for everyone to breathe. I don't know exactly how that conversation with Ashley went. She never told me in detail, and I never asked. What I know is that she called me the month after our confrontation at Birchwood Drive and said, "They're going to look at places near me," and her voice was tired but steady. We talked for 40 minutes that day, longer than we'd talked in years, about things that had nothing to do with our parents, and it felt like the beginning of something different between us. Not fixed, not easy, but honest in a way we hadn't been in a very long time. My mother calls on Sundays still. 9 o'clock, same as always. The calls are shorter now, 15 minutes instead of 20, and different in texture. She doesn't present decisions as discussions anymore. She doesn't use the careful, rehearsed tone. I don't know if that's because she learned something that afternoon in the living room on Birchwood Drive, or because she understood, finally, that the version of me who would absorb whatever she handed down without comment was gone. Maybe both. My father emails me sometimes. Short notes, a link to a Cubs article, a picture of a woodworking project he's been working on in the spare room of the new condo. Last month, he sent a photo of a small oak box he'd made, smooth and clean-cornered, and wrote, "Made this for your new house, just a place to keep things." I wrote back, "It's beautiful, Dad. Thank you." And I meant that too. Here is what I know now, standing in the kitchen of a house that is mine, with a window that looks out onto 2 oak trees, with my spreadsheet on my laptop, and Daniel's coffee going warm on the table, and our whole careful, built-from-scratch life exactly as we planned it. Being the responsible one is not a role you have to keep playing just because you were assigned it young. Stable is not the same as available. And love, real love, the kind that doesn't weaponize itself, doesn't come with conditions that shift just out of reach. The door I closed on my mother's doorstep was not the end of anything. It was the first thing I had ever built entirely on my own, without anyone's permission, and it has held.